I always thought a mother's heart was a fortress, strong, enduring, endless in its capacity to forgive, to hold, to hope. I never imagined that same heart could feel invisible, like it had been folded into a drawer and left there, untouched for years. But that's exactly how it felt that summer when my son, the only family I had left, let a marriage quietly erase me from his world. I waited for his call every morning, staring at the phone like it was a lifeline, like it carried the magic that could make things normal again. Some days it rang, and I almost believed he'd remembered me. Other days it stayed silent, and the quiet grew heavy, pressing down on my chest, making my small kitchen feel like a cage. I had raised Jason alone after his father passed, a small, solemn boy with eyes too wide for the troubles he inherited so young. I scrubbed floors with hands that ached, skipped meals when the money ran thin, and pawned keepsakes that once felt eternal, just to make sure he had shoes that fit, clothes that didn't make him stand out. I told myself that love was enough, that it would come back when the time mattered most. But love is a strange currency. It doesn't always return the way you imagine. Some of it evaporates into routines, into convenience, into the comfort of a partner who suddenly shares the space you once filled alone. When Danielle entered Jason's life, I noticed the subtle changes first, not in his voice or in the way he smiled. Those had always been mine, but in the space between words, the hesitation in his steps when he crossed the threshold of my small home. Danielle was polite, almost rehearsed, and always cheerful in a way that made my own presence feel like a shadow that didn't quite belong. I brushed it off, told myself she was just his partner, and partners bring their own energy. But it wasn't just energy, it was a shift in allegiance, a redefinition of family, and I couldn't help noticing I was no longer in that equation. The morning it started in earnest, I woke to a quiet I didn't understand. My usual breakfast sounds, the clink of spoons, the soft hum of the radio, were absent. I thought Jason might be busy, but by the afternoon, a weight settled in my chest that I couldn't shake. The phone didn't ring, the mailbox stayed stubbornly empty, and then came the first letter, a formal envelope from a law office with my name on it. I remember shaking as I opened it, hoping it was a mistake, a misdelivered piece of mail, but no. Every carefully chosen word was a declaration of my exclusion. My son, the boy I had raised, had legally changed the plans for his future, and I wasn't a part of them. Danielle's handwriting appeared later, in notes left casually on the counter. "We thought this was best for everyone," she wrote once, as if the phrase could erase the years, the sacrifices, the quiet nights I had spent worrying over a small boy who grew too fast. I read it over and over, trying to convince myself that it was a misunderstanding, that one phone call would set it right, but that call never came. Instead, I watched Jason through the window on rare afternoons when he stopped by, not for me, not for a check-in, but to move boxes, to fuss over decorations, to demonstrate the life he had built that no longer included me. Nights were the hardest. I would sit with a notebook in my lap, jotting down memories, little scraps of proof that I existed beyond the walls of my own kitchen. Each entry was a small rebellion, a quiet reminder that I hadn't vanished, that my mind still held the maps of our lives together. I remembered Jason's first steps, the sound of his laughter when he learned to ride a bike, the way he clutched my hand in the dentist's chair even when I whispered reassurances that the drill wasn't scary. I wrote these things in the quiet dark, and I felt a measure of power in that act, a way to stake my claim on the memories he was slowly leaving behind. I thought about confronting him directly, but confrontation carries its own cost. It risks alienation, it risks being seen as bitter or desperate, and I had learned over the years that patience was a far sharper tool than anger. I watched, I waited, I gathered the facts quietly. I checked the house ownership documents, the accounts we held jointly, the minor yet crucial details that Jason assumed I would forget. Every little oversight on his part was a thread I could pull. Every misstep was a reminder that the mother who raised him was not the one to be dismissed lightly. Weeks passed, each one stretching longer than the last. I felt invisible and yet fiercely present, a contradiction I had never learned to balance before. When neighbors asked about Jason's new house, I smiled politely and nodded, never mentioning that it was in the home I had tended, the yard I had planted, the walls I had cleaned until my knees ached. I held my peace like a shield, even when I saw Danielle's hand linger too long on the faucet I had polished, or when Jason made passing remarks that subtly undermined my existence. The quiet became my weapon, and the waiting my strategy. Then, one rainy Thursday, the breakthrough arrived in the most ordinary form, a misdelivered letter, small, official, overlooked. It detailed something Jason had neglected to properly formalize, a lapse that, on paper, gave me leverage. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling a surge of anticipation mixed with disbelief. After years of raising him, after every hardship endured alone, here was a crack in the armor he had built around his life. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense, not yet. It was preparation, observation, strategy. Every phone call missed, every polite smile ignored, every note left unread was now a step toward reclaiming what had been quietly stolen. I started mapping the timeline meticulously. Days when Jason was out of town, when Danielle visited her family, when the neighborhood slept quietly under the heavy summer night sky. I created a ledger in that same notebook, noting transactions, account movements, and patterns. Every detail was a potential entry point, a piece of leverage that could restore what was legally and morally mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same patience I had instilled in my son through years of gentle guidance and quiet discipline was now my ally against him. By the end of the month, I realized the truth. I wasn't waiting for a phone call anymore. I was waiting for the moment of balance to tip in my favor, and I would be ready. Jason's marriage had altered the dynamics, shifted loyalties, and for a brief moment, I felt an ache for the boy I once held. But the mother in me, resilient, cunning, unbroken, knew that this was no longer about nostalgia or grief. This was about reclaiming agency, about proving that age, love, or distance could not erase a lifetime of dedication and sacrifice. The house across the street became a symbol of everything I had lost and everything I could reclaim. I imagined sitting on the porch in the mornings, sipping coffee while Jason glanced over, realizing the life he assumed he had claimed was still, in some sense, mine to witness. I visualized conversations, silences, moments where patience and strategy would do more than anger ever could. The notebook remained at my side at night, a silent testament to the life I had built and the future I would assert. By the time the first leaves of autumn fell, I was ready to act. Not with rage, not with shouting, but with precision and patience. The same careful, meticulous care I had given Jason as a child became my guide. Every phone call unanswered, every minor legal misstep, every procedural oversight was a stepping stone. I had learned that in life, just as in family, the quiet moves often speak the loudest, and so I waited, not just for a call that might never come, but for the right moment to remind my son that the foundation he had built was not as solid as he believed. Every day I rehearsed, I remembered, I counted, and I planned. Every evening I wrote, catalogued, and dreamed. I was not bitter, I was not weak. I was preparing to reclaim what was mine, and in that preparation I found a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. I had been invisible, yes, but only temporarily. The days that followed were filled with quiet observation and subtle investigation. I had learned over decades of raising Jason that the smallest details often revealed the largest truths. His routines, the way he answered emails, how he organized his bills, even how Danielle arranged their home. Everything was a puzzle piece, and I was determined to see the whole picture. I didn't act rashly. I moved like water around a stone, patient, deliberate, waiting for the right moment when all my careful notes and observations could align. I started keeping a calendar, marking not only Jason's scheduled commitments, but also his emotional patterns. There were days when he seemed nostalgic, almost wistful, a flicker of the boy I once knew appearing briefly in his eyes. And there were days when Danielle's presence dominated every interaction, her voice soft but assertive, her laughter echoing in spaces that once belonged to me. I watched these moments closely, noting the shifts, the silences, the cracks in their polished lives. Each observation was a building block, a strategy forming in my mind. One afternoon, I decided to visit a nearby cafe I knew they frequented. It was subtle, nothing dramatic, just a woman sipping tea and taking notes in a small notebook. I pretended to read, but my eyes darted to the couple across the room. Jason laughed at something Danielle said, leaning closer than necessary, his hand brushing hers as if to assert their unity. My chest tightened, not with jealousy, but with the recognition of how invisible I had become in the life I had built for him. Yet beneath the ache was clarity. I wasn't going to react in haste. Observation was the first step toward reclaiming the ground I had lost. Evenings were my sanctuary. The house, once brimming with Jason's childhood laughter, was now quiet, but it allowed me the space to plan. I revisited old photographs, letters he had sent from college, birthday cards he had drawn with childish scrawlings, and notes I had tucked away in drawers. I catalogued them carefully, not for nostalgia alone, but as a reminder that I had shaped this life. The mother's hand was evident in every success, every lesson, every moment of resilience he exhibited. Danielle might have a role now, but she was merely a new chapter in a book I had written long before. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I made a critical discovery. A misfiled document in Jason's account records revealed a minor legal oversight, a renewal notice for a property lease that had been neglected. On its own, it was insignificant, a clerical error. But in combination with other details I had meticulously gathered, it presented an opportunity. I realized then that my patience was paying off. The small cracks in their life, unnoticed and untreated, could be leveraged, not with malice but with the precision of a hand that had long known how to care, nurture, and protect. I began preparing for the first real test, not confrontation yet, that would come later, but a gentle assertion, a reminder that I existed and that my role in Jason's life could not be erased by a marriage certificate. I drafted letters, not accusatory, but firmly rooted in fact. Each one was carefully worded to ensure clarity without hostility. I wanted Jason to recognize the truth, to confront the reality of what his absence had cost, without feeling attacked. It was delicate work, balancing emotion with strategy, but I was confident that the mother who had raised him alone was more than capable of this subtle maneuver. In parallel, I nurtured my own emotional resilience. I joined a small book club at the local library, volunteering my time for community projects, reconnecting with friends I had neglected in my single-minded focus on Jason's upbringing. Each social interaction reminded me that while my son's life had shifted, mine had not ended. I was reclaiming pieces of myself, even as I prepared to reclaim my place in his life. It was a paradox, and yet it strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just waiting for a phone call. I was building a presence that could not be ignored. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed from the warm, golden days of summer into crisp autumn evenings. I noticed small adjustments in Jason's behavior, a pause in his tone when I sent a polite inquiry, a hesitation in his steps when he passed my house. Danielle's smile remained, but there were subtle fissures in the veneer of their perfection. I documented everything, creating a timeline of interactions and observations that would guide my next moves. Every overlooked bill, every forgotten renewal, every casual slip of memory became part of a larger narrative. And in that narrative, I was not powerless. One Sunday, the culmination of my patience arrived unexpectedly. Jason and Danielle had gone out for a brunch date, leaving the house momentarily unattended. I had prepared a small package, a set of old photographs, letters, and keepsakes, carefully selected to remind Jason of our shared history. It wasn't confrontational. It was a gesture, a quiet plea, a way to bring the past gently into the present. I left it on the porch with a note simply stating, "I am here, always." It was my opening move, subtle yet impossible to ignore, a whisper that resonated louder than any argument could. The following day, Jason called. His voice was cautious, tentative, as if walking across thin ice. "Mom," he said, just that one word, but it carried the weight of years of distance, neglect, and avoidance. I didn't let emotion overtake me. I responded calmly, warmly, as if nothing had changed, yet the undertone of expectation was clear. I had waited, observed, prepared, and now, finally, I had elicited a reaction. It was a small victory, but a critical one. It reminded me that even when life shifts, even when relationships are redefined, patience and strategy could yield results. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic slowly began to shift. Our phone calls became longer, more genuine, as Jason gradually remembered the bond that had formed him. Danielle, I noticed, remained polite but less assertive. It wasn't confrontation that broke the ice, it was presence. The reminder that I existed, that my role in Jason's life was real and enduring, subtly altered their assumptions. I wasn't demanding, pleading, or invading their life. I was simply asserting a truth that had always been there. I was his mother, and no marriage could erase that. I continued to weave my life around these interactions, balancing patience with quiet strategy. I discovered that the tension between what Jason wanted to prove in his marriage and what he owed to his mother created small openings. There were moments of guilt, moments of hesitation, and moments where he sought guidance without fully realizing it. I seized these moments, offering advice gently, framing suggestions as shared experiences rather than instructions. Slowly, the lines blurred between absence and engagement, between silence and dialogue. By the time winter arrived, a new rhythm had emerged. Jason's visits became more frequent, though still tentative, and our conversations more authentic. Danielle remained in the picture, but her influence had become just one part of a broader tapestry. I realized that my role had never been truly lost. It had only been challenged, and through careful observation, patience, and strategic engagement, I was reclaiming it not with anger, but with the quiet authority that comes from decades of unwavering care and sacrifice. I sat one evening by the fireplace, my notebook open, reviewing my meticulous timeline, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. From invisible, waiting for a call that might never come, to quietly asserting my presence, I had navigated a delicate dance between love, strategy, and resilience. I realized that life's changes, no matter how painful, could be opportunities to strengthen bonds rather than sever them. I wasn't just reclaiming my place in Jason's life, I was discovering new depths of patience, courage, and self-respect within myself. And yet, as I closed the notebook that night, I knew the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more subtle shifts, more moments where my patience would be tested. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of quiet control, a recognition that the mother who had waited in silence was no longer invisible. She was present, aware, and ready for whatever came next. The following weeks brought an unexpected clarity. As Jason's calls became more frequent, I noticed subtle patterns that revealed more about his marriage than he openly admitted. It wasn't that he didn't love Danielle. Rather, it seemed he was navigating the unspoken pressures of expectation, compromise, and personal identity. These pressures were invisible to the casual observer but obvious to someone who had raised him from infancy. I realized that my role wasn't merely to remind him of the past. It was to guide him gently through the present, to act as the anchor he sometimes forgot, existed amidst the whirlwind of marital obligations. One evening, Jason called unusually late. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Mom, can I talk to you about something?" That phrase alone carried a weight that both alarmed and reassured me. Alarmed because I sensed discomfort, hesitation, and unresolved conflict in his tone. Reassured because after years of silence, he was turning to me voluntarily, seeking the guidance he had long abandoned. I invited him to speak freely, offering the patience of someone who had waited years for this very moment. He began hesitantly, recounting the subtle disagreements and compromises of married life, things Danielle found acceptable and things that left him conflicted. I listened without interruption, jotting mental notes as if each sentence were a clue in a complex puzzle. I realized then that this was the crucial moment to reinforce our bond, not through forceful intervention or criticism of his wife, but through presence, empathy, and gentle guidance. The more he spoke, the more I saw the layers of his life peeling back, revealing the person he had been before the pressures of adult responsibilities began to shape him. In the days that followed, our conversations deepened. I made a point of asking questions that encouraged reflection rather than eliciting defensive answers. How does that make you feel? Do you remember when? These prompts reminded him of the values, lessons, and emotional resilience he had developed under my care. Slowly, he began to recognize that his decisions didn't have to be dictated solely by marital expectations. They could be informed by the wisdom he had inherited from me. The realization was subtle but powerful, a quiet acknowledgement that his mother's influence was enduring, even in the shadow of marriage. Meanwhile, I continued to observe Danielle, not with resentment, but with curiosity. I noticed the small ways she controlled her environment, the ways she subtly dictated the tone of their home life. It wasn't malicious, it was simply how she had learned to navigate relationships. But these patterns, when juxtaposed with Jason's temperament, revealed points of tension that had gone unnoticed. I did not intend to exploit them. Instead, I sought to understand, to anticipate the moments when Jason might need the steadying presence only a mother could provide. My goal was clarity, not confrontation. One afternoon, while visiting the local market, I ran into an old friend who had also known Danielle's family. Their conversation, casual at first, gradually revealed insights into Danielle's upbringing, her values, and the expectations she brought into her marriage. It was illuminating, offering context to behaviors that had previously seemed perplexing or frustrating. I realized that understanding her world was as important as understanding my son's. It was the only way to navigate the new family dynamics without creating unnecessary conflict. Knowledge, I reminded myself, was power tempered by compassion. Armed with this understanding, I carefully curated small gestures of support. A thoughtful text after Jason had a difficult day, a handwritten note tucked into a package with old family photographs, a quiet phone call simply to ask how he was feeling. All of these acts reinforced my presence in his life without challenging Danielle overtly. The balance was delicate, but it was working. Jason began to recognize the difference between a mother's unconditional support and the compromises demanded by marriage. He began to confide more openly, to seek advice without fear of judgment, and most importantly, to trust that my involvement did not threaten his adult life but enriched it. At the same time, I confronted my own emotions. Jealousy and resentment occasionally surfaced, whispering that Danielle had taken the place I once held. But I reminded myself that this wasn't a competition. Marriage was a new chapter, not an erasure of our history. My task was not to reclaim Jason from Danielle, but to remind him, and by extension himself, of the continuity of love, care, and guidance that had shaped him. I began practicing mindfulness, journaling my observations, and even meditating to maintain clarity and patience. These practices were not indulgences. They were essential tools in navigating a delicate relational landscape. Then came the day that truly tested my patience. Jason announced that he and Danielle were considering a move across state lines for her career. My first instinct was panic. Distance threatened to undo months of careful rebuilding, but I did not react impulsively. Instead, I reminded myself of the strategies that had worked: observation, patience, and subtle influence. I asked questions, explored their motivations, and offered advice framed as supportive rather than directive. By doing so, I ensured that Jason felt heard and respected, while subtly encouraging him to weigh the consequences of uprooting his established emotional connections. Interestingly, the conversation revealed an unexpected side of Danielle. She expressed concerns about leaving friends, family, and familiar surroundings, and even hinted at insecurities regarding her role in Jason's life. These admissions, subtle though they were, opened the door for me to reinforce my presence not as a rival, but as an ally. I reminded Jason gently that transitions could be navigated successfully when approached with careful planning and emotional honesty. I encouraged him to maintain connections, to set boundaries, and to ensure that the bonds of the past were not lost in the rush of new opportunities. My voice, calm and measured, became a touchstone for him amidst the uncertainty of change. Over time, this approach began to yield results. Jason started to initiate small gestures of care toward me without prompting. An unexpected phone call, a thoughtful text, even a shared memory during a video chat. These were not dramatic displays, but quiet affirmations that the bond we had nurtured was real and enduring. Danielle, observing from the periphery, grew more comfortable with my presence, recognizing that it was not an intrusion but a complement to her relationship with Jason. The tension that had once characterized our interactions began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious but mutual respect. By the middle of winter, I realized that the dynamic had shifted in profound ways. Jason's life, while still influenced by marriage, now contained a space that was distinctly ours. He sought advice without fear of judgment, he shared thoughts without the filter of obligation, and he began to honor the continuity of love that had shaped him long before Danielle entered his life. I recognized that my patience, strategy, and unwavering presence had cultivated a space where trust could flourish again. The quiet evenings, once filled with longing and reflection, now became opportunities for dialogue, understanding, and gentle guidance. I discovered that patience was not merely waiting, it was active, deliberate, and purposeful. It was the art of being present without overwhelming, of influencing without controlling, and of reminding without demanding. In these moments, I realized that the heart of motherhood was not possession, but presence. It was not about erasing the new, but about ensuring that the old, the foundation, the love, the lessons, remained intact. As I prepared for the new year, I reflected on the journey so far, the calls, the observations, the carefully curated gestures of presence. They had all led to this fragile but undeniable equilibrium. I had waited, not in resignation, but in deliberate strategy. And now, as Jason navigated the complexities of marriage, career, and personal growth, he did so with a renewed awareness of the bond that had always been his anchor. I understood, finally, that my influence was not measured by control or proximity, but by consistency, wisdom, and the quiet assurance that a mother's love endures, adapts, and ultimately prevails. I was no longer waiting for a call in hope. I had earned it through patience, strategy, and unwavering care. And in that moment of clarity, I realized that the story was not just about reclaiming my place in Jason's life. It was about understanding the true depth and resilience of maternal love. The next weeks unfolded like a delicate choreography. Jason began to confide not just in fragments, but in narratives, stories about small irritations, minor triumphs, and quiet insecurities that he hadn't shared with anyone else. These revelations were never dramatic, yet each one carried a weight that underscored the subtle transformations marriage had imposed on him. I listened with unwavering attention, aware that each story was a thread in the tapestry of his evolving identity. What struck me most was how he was beginning to reconcile his role as a husband with his identity as my son, a reconciliation that, until recently, seemed almost impossible. One evening, while Jason and Danielle were out attending a work function, I received a brief text from him. "Mom, can we talk later?" Even in this simple message, there was a complexity I had come to recognize, the mix of urgency, hesitation, and trust. When we spoke that night, he confessed to feeling torn between loyalty to Danielle and the emotional habits he had developed in our family over decades. I reminded him gently that loyalty did not mean surrendering one's identity, rather it was about harmonizing relationships without losing the essence of self. My words were careful, deliberate, intended not to push but to illuminate. I noticed that the distance created by Danielle's career ambitions began to act as both a challenge and an opportunity. While I was aware that geographic separation could weaken our daily interactions, it also encouraged deeper, more meaningful exchanges when we did communicate. Letters, emails, and occasional video calls replaced casual phone conversations, forcing each interaction to carry more significance. The weight of our conversations shifted from mere updates to intentional dialogue, fostering a sense of intimacy that was both rare and precious. Each message became a testament to our enduring connection. Around this time, a subtle tension began to emerge, not between Jason and me, but between the habits of our old dynamic and the expectations of his married life. Danielle had begun to express her discomfort at the frequency and depth of our conversations, though always politely. I realized that this was not a confrontation, but an opportunity to model boundaries in a mature way. I encouraged Jason to discuss with her how our conversations served as a support system rather than a replacement for their marital connection. By framing it as a reinforcement rather than a challenge, I allowed him to assert his needs while respecting the marital space he shared with Danielle. It was during one of these conversations that Jason made a revelation that caught me slightly off guard. "Mom," he said, "sometimes I forget that my childhood shaped so much of who I am, and I think that scares Danielle." I understood immediately. His fear was not of love, but of history, the rich tapestry of experiences, expectations, and emotional patterns that a lifetime of maternal influence had instilled in him. I reassured him that acknowledging his past was not a threat to his marriage. It was a foundation upon which a stable, honest partnership could be built. In that moment, I recognized the transformative power of patience and careful guidance. It was the subtle yet profound difference between interference and influence. In the days that followed, I observed an evolution in Danielle's behavior. She became more accommodating, less reactive, and occasionally even curious about our shared history. While her interest was cautious, it demonstrated that she was beginning to appreciate that Jason's identity, and by extension, my influence, was not something to be feared. I realized that marriage, when approached with understanding, could act as a lens to reveal the deeper layers of a person rather than obscure them. The key was balance, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to nurturing trust rather than control. One particular conversation stands out vividly in my memory. Jason called one evening with an unusual sense of urgency in his voice. "Mom," he said, "I think Danielle's upset with me, but I don't know why." I asked him to recount the events that led to this moment, listening carefully to the tone, pauses, and choice of words. As he spoke, the situation became clear. Minor misunderstandings and unspoken expectations had accumulated, creating tension that neither of them had addressed directly. I guided him through strategies of empathy, active listening, and gentle acknowledgement, tools he had learned in childhood, now applied to adult relationships. By the end of the call, Jason felt equipped to approach the situation thoughtfully, without defensiveness or fear. Through these experiences, I came to understand a vital truth. Marriage does not erase the bonds of childhood, it reframes them. Jason's connection with me did not compete with his marriage. It complemented it, providing a foundation of emotional stability that allowed him to engage more authentically with Danielle. The key was patience, understanding that influence is rarely immediate, that trust must be nurtured over time, and that presence is more powerful than insistence. Every thoughtful conversation, every carefully worded text, every patient listening moment became part of this ongoing effort. During this period, I also reflected deeply on my own role. It was easy to fall into the trap of nostalgia, of longing for a time when Jason's attention was solely mine. But I recognized that such yearning was unproductive. Instead, I focused on the present, the moments when I could offer clarity, comfort, or perspective. I realized that motherhood, in its truest form, evolves over time. It adapts to the changing needs of the child, even when the child is an adult navigating complex relationships. My task was no longer to dominate the narrative, but to guide it subtly, with patience, insight, and unwavering love. One particularly poignant moment occurred during a quiet winter afternoon. Jason called to share that he had made a difficult decision at work, one that aligned with his values but conflicted with Danielle's expectations. As he spoke, I noticed a shift in his tone, confidence, tempered with concern, replacing hesitation and doubt. I guided him through reflection on his motivations, the consequences of his choices, and the importance of honest communication. By the end of the conversation, he expressed gratitude not just for my advice, but for the reassurance that his identity was valid, even within the framework of marriage. As the season progressed, these small victories accumulated into a larger pattern. Jason became more self-assured, more capable of articulating his needs and navigating disagreements without fear or resentment. Danielle, in turn, began to respect the space I occupied in his life, recognizing that my influence was not a threat but a stabilizing force. The delicate balance of presence, empathy, and guidance that I had cultivated began to pay off in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Our bond, tested by distance, time, and the pressures of adult responsibilities, had not only endured, it had strengthened. In parallel, I began to notice changes in myself. Patience, once an aspiration, had become a practiced skill. Observation, once passive, had become intentional. Influence, once feared as intrusive, had become nuanced and respectful. I realized that the journey was not just about Jason, it was also about personal growth, about understanding the dynamics of adult relationships, and about learning to navigate complexity without compromising integrity or compassion. Each call, each interaction, each careful gesture became an opportunity for mutual growth. Through it all, the subtle art of contrast framing, highlighting choices and consequences without judgment, proved invaluable. I encouraged Jason to see how his decisions affected not just his present, but his future, how the lessons of childhood could inform adult choices, and how marriage could coexist with maternal guidance. By presenting options clearly and calmly, without pressure or criticism, I allowed him to make informed choices while maintaining his autonomy. The results were remarkable: confidence, clarity, and a growing sense of resilience. By the end of this period, it was clear that the dynamics of our relationship had shifted profoundly. Jason's calls, once tentative and sporadic, had become intentional and meaningful. Danielle's subtle acceptance of my presence reflected a growing understanding that love and influence are not zero-sum. They can coexist, complement, and enhance one another. And I, having waited patiently, acted thoughtfully, and guided consistently, had reclaimed a space not through force but through trust, empathy, and enduring care. The evolution of our relationship did not happen overnight, nor was it linear. Some days were fraught with tension, small misunderstandings, or lingering resentment from old patterns. Yet these moments, challenging as they were, became opportunities for growth, reflection, and reinforcement of trust. Jason learned that the security of marriage did not require abandoning the comfort of his childhood bonds. Danielle began to recognize that my presence in his life was a source of stability rather than competition. And I, in turn, discovered that letting go of control was not synonymous with irrelevance. It was an affirmation of respect for the lives my child had built. One particularly challenging evening exemplified this delicate balance. Jason called me late, his voice tight with frustration. "Mum, Danielle's upset again, and I don't know what to do," he admitted. I immediately recognized the familiar pattern of miscommunication compounded by unspoken expectations. I asked him to slow down, take a deep breath, and recount the events without self-blame or defensiveness. As he spoke, I noticed his tone soften, his words gaining precision. Instead of reacting to the emotions swirling between him and Danielle, we analyzed the situation with care. I guided him through techniques of active listening, reflective responses, and gentle honesty. By the end of our conversation, he felt equipped not just to address the immediate issue, but to reinforce the underlying trust in his marriage. It was in moments like these that I realized the power of contrast framing. I encouraged Jason to see the difference between reaction and reflection, between immediate emotional response and deliberate communication. By highlighting the potential consequences of each choice without casting judgment, he could navigate complex relational dynamics with clarity and confidence. This method, subtle but transformative, became the cornerstone of our interactions. Each call was no longer just a transfer of information, it was a deliberate exercise in cultivating emotional intelligence and resilience. As winter deepened, Jason's growth became increasingly evident. His conversations shifted from tentative and uncertain to deliberate and insightful. He began to articulate his needs, desires, and boundaries with a calm assurance that had been absent before. Danielle, observing these changes, began to engage more openly with him, demonstrating a willingness to understand rather than react. The subtle shift in her demeanor reflected a deeper recognition. Jason's identity, shaped by his upbringing, did not compete with their marriage. It enriched it. The delicate equilibrium we had worked so hard to achieve was finally taking root. During this period, I also reflected deeply on the importance of self-awareness. It became clear that my role was not to dictate outcomes, but to facilitate understanding. Every suggestion, every piece of advice was framed as a tool rather than a mandate. Jason's growth depended on his autonomy, his ability to choose, and his willingness to act in accordance with his values. By embracing this approach, I allowed him to internalize lessons rather than simply follow instructions. The subtle shift from dependency to empowerment became the hallmark of our evolving relationship. One afternoon, a particularly memorable interaction occurred. Jason called to share that he had confronted a difficult situation at work, one that tested both his principles and his patience. As he described the scenario, I noticed his voice steadier, more confident, a reflection of the inner strength he was cultivating. I guided him through a reflective process, identifying the emotions involved, evaluating the potential outcomes, and choosing a course of action aligned with his values. By the end of the call, he expressed not only relief but pride in his ability to navigate the challenge independently. It was a subtle but profound moment, a testament to the power of guidance tempered with respect for autonomy. Meanwhile, Danielle's attitude continued to evolve. She began to initiate conversations about our shared history, not as an intrusion, but as a way to understand the foundation upon which Jason's character had been built. These discussions, cautious at first, became increasingly natural. I realized that her curiosity was not about control or competition, but about connection. She sought to understand the roots of Jason's values, his habits, and his emotional responses. By embracing these conversations with openness and patience, I demonstrated that maternal influence could coexist harmoniously with marital partnership. In tandem with these relational developments, I began to observe a subtle change in myself. The act of waiting, once a source of anxiety and longing, transformed into an exercise in patience and perspective. Each phone call, message, or visit became an opportunity to practice empathy, reflection, and measured guidance. I discovered that influence was not exerted through frequency or insistence, but through consistency, clarity, and respect. The lessons I imparted were no longer simply about advice. They were about modeling thoughtful decision-making, emotional regulation, and balanced perspective. One key realization emerged during this time: the importance of timing. Advice, guidance, or reflection is most effective when offered at the precise moment it is needed, not imposed prematurely. I learned to listen not only to words, but to tone, pause, and context, discerning when to speak and when to hold silence. This subtlety became a defining characteristic of our interactions. Jason responded not out of obligation or habit, but out of genuine trust and recognition of the value in careful reflection. Our conversations, once tentative and sporadic, were now purposeful, meaningful, and mutually enriching. The challenges of balancing maternal influence with marital dynamics were not eliminated, they were reframed. Instead of competing for attention or loyalty, we focused on reinforcement and support. Jason began to view our relationship as a source of guidance rather than conflict, and Danielle began to see my presence as a stabilizing influence rather than a threat. The delicate interplay of empathy, patience, and strategic communication transformed potential points of tension into opportunities for connection. During this season, I also encouraged Jason to engage in reflective journaling, a practice he had resisted in the past. By writing down his thoughts, emotions, and interactions, he gained clarity on recurring patterns, triggers, and successes. This exercise not only enhanced self-awareness, but also improved communication with Danielle. He began to articulate his feelings more clearly, navigate disagreements more thoughtfully, and approach challenges with a balanced perspective. The cumulative effect of these small but consistent practices was profound, strengthening both his marriage and our bond. By midwinter, it was clear that the foundations we had laid were beginning to yield tangible results. Jason's confidence, clarity, and emotional intelligence were noticeably stronger. Danielle's willingness to engage, understand, and collaborate reflected a growing respect for the history and bonds that shaped her husband. And I, having exercised patience, reflection, and strategic guidance, felt a renewed sense of purpose and fulfillment. The journey, though challenging, had reinforced a vital truth. Love, influence, and understanding are not zero-sum. They can coexist, complement, and elevate one another when approached with care and intention. Through it all, the subtle art of contrast, highlighting choices, consequences, and the spectrum of possibilities, remained central to our interactions. Jason learned to see the broader context of his decisions, to weigh immediate reactions against long-term outcomes, and to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with nuance and grace. This practice, cultivated over countless conversations and reflections, became an internalized skill that empowered him not just in his marriage, but in every facet of adult life. By the time spring approached, a quiet transformation had settled over our relationship. Jason's phone calls, once filled with uncertainty and anxious hesitation, now carried a tone of confidence and deliberation. Danielle's presence in his life, far from being a threat, had become a stabilizing factor that Jason often referenced when making decisions. Their marriage, which had initially seemed like a potential wedge between us, instead became a framework within which he could exercise independence, emotional insight, and practical judgment. Watching this unfold, I began to understand the deeper lesson marriage had introduced: not competition, but collaboration. One afternoon, Jason called with a situation that perfectly illustrated this evolution. Danielle had suggested a major change in their household routine, a change that Jason initially found disruptive. In the past, he might have reacted defensively or deferred without much thought. But this time, he approached the conversation differently. He calmly explained the reasoning behind Danielle's suggestion, evaluated its potential benefits and challenges, and even proposed a compromise that incorporated both their perspectives. By the end of our call, Jason was not only relieved but proud of his ability to navigate the situation independently while honoring the marital partnership. It was a milestone, subtle yet profound, in his journey toward adult relational competence. This period also highlighted the importance of empathy in guiding our interactions. I realized that my role was not to instruct or correct, but to help Jason step into the shoes of those around him: Danielle, colleagues, friends, even strangers he encountered in daily life. By framing choices in terms of their impact on others, he began to see situations more holistically. Instead of reacting purely from personal desire or convenience, he began to weigh outcomes with consideration for both immediate and long-term effects. This shift in perspective, though gradual, strengthened not just his marriage but his relationships with others, fostering trust, mutual respect, and genuine connection. One of the techniques I introduced during this phase was the use of scenario planning. I encouraged Jason to anticipate potential responses and consequences before engaging in difficult conversations. For example, if Danielle proposed a change he disagreed with, he would first reflect on her motivations, predict potential outcomes of different responses, and then select the approach that would maintain harmony while honoring his values. Practicing this method consistently allowed him to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Over time, this became second nature, a cognitive framework that not only enhanced communication but also reinforced self-confidence. Meanwhile, Danielle's perception of my involvement continued to shift. She began to understand that my guidance was not intended to undermine her role as a partner, but to support Jason in developing emotional intelligence and independent decision-making. There were moments of tension, of course, when misunderstandings arose or when differing expectations collided, but instead of letting these moments create lasting conflict, we treated them as opportunities for clarification, negotiation, and reinforcement of boundaries. Danielle came to see that respect for my role in Jason's life did not diminish her own authority as a spouse, it complemented it. During this period, I also began to reflect more deeply on my own emotional journey. The initial anxiety and longing I had felt while waiting for Jason's calls had gradually transformed into a sense of purpose and calm. I realized that influence is most effective when exercised with patience, understanding, and respect for autonomy. Every conversation, every suggestion was an opportunity to model thoughtful decision-making rather than to dictate outcomes. By embracing this mindset, I felt a renewed sense of fulfillment and clarity, confident that my role in Jason's life had evolved into one of meaningful guidance rather than necessity. One particularly illustrative evening involved a minor disagreement between Jason and Danielle regarding social obligations. Jason was hesitant to express his true preferences, fearing it might upset Danielle. We discussed strategies for navigating the situation, ways to communicate honestly while remaining considerate of her feelings. By the time he ended the call, he had formulated a plan that balanced his needs with hers, demonstrating both assertiveness and empathy. This incident, though small, reinforced the progress he had made in integrating lessons from our conversations into real-life interactions. Another subtle but significant development was Jason's increasing ability to self-reflect before seeking guidance. In the past, he might have called immediately at the first sign of conflict or uncertainty. Now he often paused to analyze situations, identify possible approaches, and even try preliminary solutions before consulting me. When he did call, our discussions were richer, more focused, and mutually constructive. This shift indicated a profound internalization of the principles we had worked on: autonomy, reflection, and careful decision-making. I began to see the direct results of the guidance I had provided, not in dependence, but in empowered action. Spring also brought opportunities for shared family experiences that further reinforced relational harmony. During a weekend visit, Danielle suggested we all take part in a project that combined household improvement with creative expression. Initially, I hesitated, worried about overstepping boundaries, but Danielle's inclusive approach encouraged me to participate, and Jason facilitated communication in a way that honored both of our perspectives. The result was not only a completed project, but also a shared sense of accomplishment and camaraderie. Observing the interplay of respect, collaboration, and mutual support, I realized that the foundation we had built extended beyond guidance into genuine partnership. Throughout this period, I continued to emphasize the value of contrast in understanding choices and consequences. Jason learned to distinguish between immediate impulses and considered responses, between emotional reactions and deliberate action. By framing decisions in terms of potential outcomes, he could evaluate alternatives with clarity and foresight. This practice, reinforced through repeated conversation and reflection, became an internal compass guiding his interactions with Danielle, colleagues, and others. The subtle yet consistent application of these principles transformed decision-making from a source of stress into a structured, empowering process. Another turning point occurred when Jason began mentoring a younger colleague at work. Applying the same principles we had developed at home, he guided this colleague with patience, empathy, and strategic insight. Witnessing his ability to transfer relational skills to professional contexts highlighted the depth of his growth. It was no longer about parental influence or marital navigation alone. It was about the holistic development of a capable, emotionally intelligent adult. Danielle's acknowledgement of his achievements in this arena further reinforced the balance and mutual respect that had become central to our interactions. By the end of spring, a noticeable pattern had emerged. Jason's interactions, whether with Danielle, family, or colleagues, displayed a balance of confidence, empathy, and strategic thinking. Danielle's engagement, once tentative and cautious, had become collaborative and supportive, and I, having embraced patience, strategic guidance, and self-reflection, felt a deep sense of satisfaction in witnessing the culmination of our shared efforts. The journey, though gradual and nuanced, had crystallized into a model of relational harmony where maternal influence, marital partnership, and personal growth coexisted seamlessly. Summer arrived with a sense of quiet momentum, the kind that accompanies steady progress rather than sudden breakthroughs. Jason and Danielle had settled into a rhythm that balanced individuality and partnership, and I could sense a new level of maturity emerging in him. The calls we shared had evolved from logistical check-ins or urgent problem-solving into reflective, meaningful conversations. Jason began initiating topics on growth, values, and long-term goals, often framing them in the context of both his marriage and his personal development. This shift was subtle but profound. It indicated not just progress in decision-making, but a deeper awareness of life's interconnected responsibilities. One afternoon, Jason called me in a contemplative mood. He wanted to discuss an upcoming family reunion that Danielle was organizing. In previous years, such events had triggered stress or indecision, leaving him caught between his preferences and the expectations of relatives. But this time, he approached the conversation differently. He laid out potential scenarios, weighed the emotional impact on different family members, and even proposed ways to maintain his boundaries without causing tension. By the end of our conversation, he had a clear plan that honored both his comfort and his role as a husband and son. It was a practical application of everything we had been working on: empathy, strategic thinking, and assertive communication. Danielle's influence in these decisions became increasingly evident. She had a natural ability to encourage collaboration while honoring Jason's autonomy. Where I had once guided him directly, Danielle's presence now helped him apply those lessons in real time. This interplay between guidance from a parent and support from a spouse created a dynamic environment in which Jason could flourish. I realized that my role was no longer about direct intervention, but about reinforcing principles and helping him reflect on his own judgment. This shift required patience and humility, but the rewards were unmistakable. I could witness growth that was genuinely his own, rather than a reflection of my influence. During one particularly revealing conversation, Jason expressed uncertainty about balancing his professional ambitions with marital responsibilities. He feared that pursuing certain career opportunities might create tension or distance between him and Danielle. We discussed strategies for integrating work, personal development, and marital harmony. I encouraged him to communicate transparently with Danielle, consider long-term implications, and explore creative compromises that aligned with their shared values. By the time our call ended, he had a practical roadmap for navigating career growth without compromising his relationship. The discussion was a testament to how far he had come. Rather than approaching challenges with anxiety, he now tackled them with strategic foresight and emotional clarity. At the same time, I observed subtle shifts in Danielle's behavior. She increasingly sought Jason's input on decisions, valuing his perspective while trusting his judgment. Where early in their marriage she might have anticipated guidance or reassurance from me, she now deferred to Jason's reasoning, only consulting me when he specifically sought an external perspective. This evolution highlighted a critical aspect of relational growth. Influence is most effective when it is empowering rather than controlling. By stepping back, I allowed both Jason and Danielle to claim agency, strengthening their marital bond while maintaining my role as a supportive mentor. Our conversations during this period also explored the theme of identity within relationships. Jason was learning to assert himself without diminishing Danielle's presence, to express preferences without causing conflict, and to negotiate differences without feeling compromised. We practiced framing techniques that highlighted contrast, identifying alternative approaches, potential consequences, and emotional impact. These exercises, though simple in concept, had transformative effects on his confidence and communication style. Over time, they became habitual thought patterns, equipping him with tools to navigate not only marital interactions, but all relationships with increased clarity and emotional intelligence. One evening, a minor disagreement arose between Jason and Danielle about household priorities. In previous years, such conflicts might have escalated into tension or silent resentment. But this time, Jason approached the situation calmly. He acknowledged Danielle's perspective, articulated his own needs, and proposed a compromise that respected both viewpoints. Danielle responded with openness, and together they arrived at a solution that strengthened, rather than strained, their relationship. Later, he shared the experience with me over the phone, reflecting on how the skills we had developed, active listening, empathy, and strategic compromise, enabled them to turn potential friction into growth. Another significant development was Jason's increasing willingness to embrace vulnerability. He began sharing not only logistical concerns, but also emotional reflections, fears, hopes, and uncertainties. These conversations revealed a depth of self-awareness that was both surprising and gratifying. He spoke candidly about moments of doubt, acknowledging past tendencies toward avoidance or impulsivity. By articulating these internal experiences, he reinforced his commitment to personal growth while inviting collaborative problem-solving with Danielle. This openness created a foundation of trust, demonstrating that true partnership thrives not only on shared goals, but also on mutual emotional transparency. As summer progressed, I noticed that Jason was increasingly proactive in anticipating Danielle's needs and preferences. Whether planning social events, managing household responsibilities, or coordinating professional schedules, he approached tasks with attentiveness and foresight. This anticipatory mindset reduced friction, increased efficiency, and strengthened relational harmony. It was a clear illustration of how learned principles, contrast framing, empathy, and reflective decision-making had been internalized and applied spontaneously. The transformation was no longer theoretical. It was evident in his daily actions and interactions. During one of our longer phone conversations, we discussed the concept of legacy within family and marriage. Jason was curious about how small, consistent actions shape long-term relational outcomes. We explored examples from both his own experiences and broader contexts, analyzing the cumulative effect of respect, communication, and shared responsibility. By the end of the call, he expressed a sense of purpose that extended beyond immediate convenience or desire. He recognized that marriage was not simply a personal milestone, but a living framework that required continuous attention, intentionality, and adaptation. This realization marked a turning point in his maturity, emphasizing that relationships thrive not by chance, but by deliberate, conscious effort. In reflecting on these developments, I also became more aware of my own emotional growth. Watching Jason navigate life with confidence and integrity provided a profound sense of fulfillment. It reminded me that guidance is most meaningful when it nurtures autonomy rather than dependence. By stepping back strategically, I allowed Jason to claim ownership of his decisions while reinforcing the underlying principles that had guided his evolution. Danielle's partnership further amplified this dynamic, creating an environment in which love, respect, and mutual growth coexisted naturally. One notable evening, Jason and Danielle shared news about a mutual friend experiencing marital challenges. Jason approached the conversation with measured insight, offering advice that was both empathetic and constructive. He drew upon lessons from his own experiences, articulating strategies for communication, compromise, and emotional awareness. Danielle listened attentively, and together they reflected on how shared understanding and cooperative problem-solving could mitigate conflict. Their collaborative approach, rooted in mutual respect and learned principles, highlighted the far-reaching impact of consistent relational growth. By the end of summer, a distinct pattern had emerged. Jason's interactions were marked by clarity, intentionality, and empathy. Danielle's engagement reflected trust and collaboration, and my guidance had become subtle, focused on reinforcement rather than direct intervention. The evolution was remarkable not only in its outcomes but in the underlying processes. Strategic reflection, contrast framing, and deliberate emotional engagement had become ingrained habits, supporting decisions, actions, and relational dynamics across multiple spheres of life. As autumn approached, a quiet shift took place, not dramatic enough to announce itself, but steady enough to change the atmosphere of everything around us. Jason's calls became less frequent yet more intentional. When he did call, there was no urgency in his voice, no restless searching for answers. Instead, there was calm, grounded confidence. I recognized it immediately, not as distance, but as growth. He was no longer calling because he needed reassurance. He was calling because he wanted connection. And that difference mattered more than he probably realized. One evening, weeks after our last long conversation, Jason called while walking home from work. I could hear the rhythm of his footsteps, the hum of traffic fading in and out. He spoke about small things at first, the way the city looked at dusk, how Danielle had started lighting candles during dinner just because it made the apartment feel warmer. Then he paused, and I knew something heavier was coming. He told me he'd been thinking about how much his life had changed since getting married, and how he hadn't expected the change to be so quiet. No dramatic turning points, no clear dividing line, just a gradual shift where priorities rearranged themselves without asking permission. He admitted that early on he thought marriage would add something on top of his life, like an extra layer. Instead, it rearranged the foundation. Time felt different now. Decisions carried weight in ways they hadn't before. Even silence meant something new. He said there were moments when he missed the simplicity of just calling me whenever he felt uncertain, but that he also felt proud that he didn't need to do that anymore. Hearing that stung in a way I hadn't anticipated, but beneath the sting was something warmer. Relief. This was exactly what I'd hoped for, even if I hadn't fully prepared myself for how it would feel. Danielle entered the conversation naturally when they got home. I could hear her in the background, teasing Jason for pacing while talking, telling him to sit down before he wore a hole in the floor. She greeted me warmly, her tone relaxed, familiar. There was no tension, no competition for space, just coexistence. She mentioned they were planning to host a small dinner with friends, nothing elaborate, just people they cared about, food cooked slowly, conversations that didn't rush toward conclusions. It struck me how intentional their lives had become, not in a forced way, but in a thoughtful one. After Danielle stepped away, Jason grew quieter. He told me something he hadn't said before. He said that for a long time, he felt torn between being a good son and being a good husband, like choosing one automatically meant disappointing the other. But lately, that tension had softened. He realized that adulthood wasn't about replacing one bond with another, but about learning how to hold multiple relationships without letting them collapse into each other. He didn't need to call me every day to love me. He didn't need my approval for every decision to respect me. Love, he said, had expanded, not shifted. That night, after we hung up, I sat alone longer than usual, letting the silence stretch without rushing to fill it. I thought about all the years when I waited for his calls, the way my heart used to jump at the sound of the phone, the way absence once felt like loss. I realized something quietly important. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not because I'd stopped caring, but because my life had space in it again. His independence had given me back my own. In the weeks that followed, my days settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. I started attending a morning walking group in the neighborhood, something I'd always told myself I didn't have time for. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected without realizing it. I picked up old habits, reading in the afternoon, cooking meals that took patience instead of convenience. The phone still rang, but it no longer dictated my emotional weather. When Jason called, it was a gift, not a measurement of my worth. One Sunday afternoon, Jason and Danielle visited, not for a reason, not out of obligation, just because they wanted to. Danielle helped in the kitchen while Jason fixed a loose cabinet hinge he'd noticed months ago. There was laughter, easy and unforced. At one point, I caught Jason watching Danielle as she talked, the way his attention stayed with her even when the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic affection, it was quieter than that, anchored. And I understood then that marriage hadn't taken him away from me. It had taught him how to stay. Later, as they were getting ready to leave, Jason hugged me longer than usual. Not rushed, not distracted. He told me thank you, not for anything specific, just thank you. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. As they walked out, I felt something close to peace settle in my chest, the kind that doesn't demand proof. That night, I thought about all the parents who wait by the phone, interpreting silence as rejection, change as loss. I thought about how easy it is to confuse closeness with dependence and love with access. Marriage changes everything, but not in the way we fear. It doesn't erase the past, it reorganizes the future. And sometimes, what feels like being left behind is actually being trusted enough to be let go. I still hear from Jason. Sometimes it's a quick check-in, sometimes it's a long conversation about life, work, or nothing at all. But I no longer measure the strength of our bond by frequency. I measure it by steadiness, by the way he shows up when it matters, by the way he carries the lessons of family into the life he's building. And when the phone is quiet, I don't feel forgotten. I feel finished waiting. Winter arrived gently that year, not with storms or sudden cold, but with a quiet settling that mirrored the season I felt inside myself. The days grew shorter, the mornings slower, and the evenings longer, giving space for reflection in a way I hadn't experienced before. Jason called less often during that stretch, but when he did, his voice carried warmth, like someone calling from a well-lit room. There was no guilt in the pauses between our conversations anymore, no unspoken questions hanging in the air. We had both learned how to live without holding the phone too tightly. One evening, close to the holidays, Jason called to tell me they were hosting their first official holiday dinner as a married couple. Not a big gathering, just a handful of friends who couldn't travel, people who didn't have anywhere else to go. Danielle was excited, already planning the menu, already thinking about who might need a quiet corner or an early night. Jason laughed as he told me this, saying he'd never thought about holidays that way before. He used to think of them as events you attended. Now he thought of them as something you built. He asked if I'd come, not out of obligation, not because it was expected, but because they wanted me there, and that distinction mattered more than the invitation itself. I told him yes, of course, and when we hung up, I felt something gentle unfold in my chest. Not anticipation, not relief. Belonging. The dinner was simple and imperfect. The food was good but not flawless. Someone burned the rolls. Someone spilled a drink. Laughter filled the space where perfection used to try to live. I watched Jason move through the room, attentive without hovering, present without performing. I watched Danielle host with a confidence that came not from control, but from care. And I realized that this was what I'd been waiting for all along. Not his calls, not his attention, but his becoming. Later that night, as I was getting ready to leave, Jason walked me to the door. He thanked me again for coming, for understanding, for giving him space, even when it couldn't have been easy. I told him the truth, that letting go wasn't something I did for him. It was something I did for myself. He nodded, like he understood, even if he couldn't fully feel it yet. Driving home, I thought about how many years I'd spent measuring my value by how needed I was, how easily love can turn into waiting and waiting into resentment if you're not careful. Marriage didn't change Jason by pulling him away. It changed me by showing me that love doesn't shrink when it grows in new directions. It multiplies if you let it. In the months that followed, life continued in its steady, unremarkable way. Jason and Danielle built routines. I built my own. We shared milestones, small victories, occasional frustrations. But there was no longer an undercurrent of tension, no quiet competition for time or loyalty. We had found our places, not by negotiation, but by trust. One afternoon, Jason called just to tell me about a book he was reading. Nothing profound, just something that made him think of me. We talked for 20 minutes, then said goodbye easily, without dragging it out. When the call ended, I didn't sit staring at the phone. I went back to what I was doing, my life uninterrupted, my heart full. That's when it hit me. I hadn't lost my son. I had gained a new relationship with him, one built on choice instead of dependence, on respect instead of expectation, on love that didn't require constant proof. Marriage changes everything, but not all change is loss. Sometimes change is an invitation to step into a new version of yourself, a version that doesn't wait by the phone, a version that understands that silence isn't absence, a version that knows when to hold on and when to step back. I still think about those early days when the phone felt like a lifeline, when every unanswered call felt personal. I wish I could tell that version of myself what I know now, that love doesn't disappear when it grows quieter, that being needed isn't the same as being loved, and that sometimes the greatest gift your child's marriage gives you is the chance to reclaim your own life. Jason still calls. I still answer. But now when the phone rings, it's not the center of my world. It's just part of it. And when it doesn't ring, I don't feel forgotten. I feel steady, grounded, whole. I waited for my son's call for a long time. I thought it meant everything. But marriage didn't take that away. It showed me something better. That love doesn't live in waiting. It lives in trust, in growth, and in the quiet confidence that no matter how life changes, the bond remains, not because we cling to it, but because we've learned how to let it breathe.